want to talk about the James Webb Space Telescope, but first, I want to talk about the Hubble Space Telescope, WHST. Hubble launched in 1990, and for the past 30 years, it's just banger after banger after banger after banger. Astronomers are still writing proposals, submitting them to NASA, applying for Hubble time to point at unique objects and learn new physics. And they're all getting rejected because hundreds of other astronomers also have unique and exciting ideas, and there's just not enough Hubble time. More important, I think, than Hubble's science mission and science goals, which it has long since surpassed, is the outreach, the education, the inspiration that Hubble has done. I mean, every single person knows the Hubble Space Telescope. Every single person has seen an image from Hubble and been like, wow. People have tattoos, they have Hubble merch, they have their phone screen set to the astronomy picture of the day. Everyone's seen Hubble. If you have attended public school in the past 30 years, any astronomy adjacent lecture was probably attached to slide after slide after slide of Hubble images. And I think that's amazing. A huge bonus that's free from the science mission is just communicating science with the public. My favorite part of the Hubble Space Telescope is the name. The Hubble Space Telescope is named after Edwin Hubble. So if you are a little second grader sitting in class and the teacher says, oh, here's a picture of a galaxy from the HST, and you go home and Google Hubble, the telescope comes up, a contact company comes up, and then you get the Wikipedia page for Edwin Hubble. And I think Hubble's wiki page is one of the best examples of what the life of a scientist can be. Hubble worked in astronomy like 100 years ago, up to the 1950s. And what he's most well known for is being one of the first people to say, hey guys, these galactic nebulas that we're seeing in our telescopes, they're not nebulas, they're galaxies. They're galaxies like the Milky Way. They're really far away and they're everywhere and they're different. And he started cataloging the morphologies, and people were just like, bro, what are you talking about? Like, the galaxy is the universe. There isn't anything outside of the galaxy. But of course, Hubble was correct, and he started the field of extragalactic astronomy. And because of extragalactic astronomy, we were able to look at these galaxies and notice, hey, they're all moving away from us. The universe must be expanding, which led to the Big Bang Theory. We could start looking at the velocity of the stars on the outskirts of these galaxies, and we notice, hey, these stars are moving a lot faster than we would expect. There must be a lot of missing mass in galaxies, and that's how you get dark matter. All in the last 100 years. I mean, humans have been doing astronomy for 5,000 years at least. 100 years ago, we thought there was one galaxy until Edwin Hubble. And what is really just serendipitously beautiful is that the Hubble Space Telescope's most famous image, arguably, is the Hubble Deep Field, where the telescope was pointed at a very dark area of sky, at like a really small area. Like, imagine you're holding your pinky fingernail up to the night sky, like the size of like the white bit. And it took a very long exposure over like 10 nights and compiled the image, and we get the Hubble Deep Field. So we point at a dark area of sky, and it turns out it's not dark at all. It's full of galaxies, and they're different, and they have lots of different colors, and they're everywhere. And Hubble was right. Like, if you make the movie of Edwin Hubble, you will start with some debate where some scientist is like, this guy thinks there's galaxies, and you could end with the Hubble Deep Field and saying, wow. Right? What a great story.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme, every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one. Hopefully it'll work.
And lucky for us, the HST's successor, the James Webb Space Telescope, JWST, launched in December of 2021, only 14 years behind schedule, $5 billion with a B dollars over budget. The first science images will be released in July of 2022, and the work that this telescope does will change the way we view the universe. We built the telescope on Earth, strapped it to a rocket, drove that rocket to a very specific location in the solar system. We parked it there. It remotely deployed all of its instruments and its sun shield. We will be driving it from Earth so that it maintains that orbit. We will be taking data from Earth remotely. It's probably the greatest engineering achievement of human civilization so far and ever, because the Supreme Court nerfed the EPA and we're gonna die in the climate wars. But it's a really exciting telescope. So who's James Webb? Why? James Webb was the head NASA administrator between 1961 and 1968. He had a really difficult job because NASA was a new organization, but he was also tasked with proving to the world that we have a robust and strong space program. Because NASA was so new, there were lots of politics involved. Senators kept trying to get into his ear, being like, we should launch the rockets from South Carolina or Florida or Georgia. And James Webb was very specific about ensuring that nothing was overtly political. He wanted to talk to the scientists and say, where is the best place to launch? Where is the best place to put a base? What should we do? And by all accounts, James Webb was very successful by his job. And also, we know, because the Apollo missions were successful, Americans landed on the moon. Great. I have read a bunch of articles and interviews and even a biography of James Webb. And what really stuck out to me was how uninterested James Webb was in science. If you just Google any article, you will see a cute little story where John F. Kennedy is like, hey, come be the NASA administrator. And James Webb is like, no, you should get a scientist. You should get a rocket scientist. I'm not interested in science. I'm a policy guy. And JFK is like, we need a policy guy, you know, because the guy who's right for the job is the guy who doesn't want it, who has the best story. And that's okay, right? The NASA administrator doesn't have to be super interested in science. Like that's fine. Like as long as you are good at administration, you could still be good at this job, as James Webb was. But what's odd to me is that we would name the flagship mission of NASA a science mission after someone who was so desperately uninterested in science. Like, let me introduce you to the pantheon of space telescopes. You have the Compton Gamma Ray Observatory, named after Compton, a very, very famous scientist. You have the Chandra X-ray Observatory, named after Chandrasekhar, a very, very famous scientist. Hubble, of course, Hubble's very famous. And then the other great observatory is Spitzer, named after Spitzer, a very famous scientist. And there are more telescopes. Notice all the telescopes named after humans are named after scientists whose work was instrumental in how the instrument functions or the science mission of that instrument. And then, of course, there are like acronym names for telescopes. And then you have JWST, the best, the biggest, the newest, shiniest telescope, named after James Webb, NASA administrator.
That's suspicious. That's weird.
I mean, just look at this interview for Johnson's Presidential Library with James Webb, where the interview is like, but NASA Administrator Webb didn't go to the launches, did he? And in the most defensive statement I've ever seen in my life, James Webb is like, hey, I went to one launch, all right? I saw one, I saw it, that's fine. And it's just like, you went to one launch? Like, how can you be so intellectually uncurious, lacking curiosity, that you don't go to the launches? When I was a kid in the 90s and the shuttle was launching, people in my class would talk about how their parents were so excited and they drove 17 hours only to get to Florida and have to be in Florida for a couple of days. They would wake up at 4 a.m., drive to a parking lot 4 miles away from the launch pad and just watch. And it was the best moment of their life. And they remember it forever. And it was so exciting. And James Webb is like, no thanks. They need me in DC. Which again, it's fine not to be interested in space. It's fine. But why would you name a telescope after someone who's not interested in space? So this is a huge break from tradition to name a telescope after administrator rather than a scientist, but surely there's a reason. Surely there's a reason. Now, I was not a physicist in 2003 when the James Webb Space Telescope was named after James Webb, so I was not aware that it happened. And it wasn't until 2013 when I started my coursework that I learned about the James Webb Space Telescope. Because telescopes are always named after scientists, I assumed that James Webb was some very famous cosmologist, and eventually in my coursework I will reach like the Webb equations and I'll learn a bunch of cosmology from this very famous cosmologist. But that's of course not the case. So my next thought was, okay, surely NASA had some sort of committee. They met over a bunch of weeks. They had a bunch of discussions, and like obviously for a reason that is very important that I will learn at some point if I just find the answer, the telescope had to be named after James Webb. He was the best choice. Or maybe at a WAS meeting, you have 3,000 astronomers. They're all debating, and then like everyone handed out note cards and they all voted. And because of an obvious reason, which I will learn if I just find the right article, it has to be James Webb. James Webb is the best person to name the greatest human achievement of all time after. James Webb is the most important person to the field of cosmology, which is why this telescope has to be named after James Webb. That's not the case, and I'll tell you why. It's because the James Webb Space Telescope was named by a single person without discussion with anyone. Well, let you hear from the man himself, Sean O'Keefe, NASA administrator, how the telescope was named.
O'Keefe casually asked folks how they'd feel about naming it after Webb.
It was not a formal process. There was no panel. There was no appointed group of commissioners to come up with a name. No, it was more of a, what do you think of this idea?
No one objected, so Webb got the honor.
It was just a casual thing. There was no formal discussion. I just said, what do you think of this idea? What do you think of James Webb? And people were into it. Okay, I think this is very funny because Sean O'Keefe was the head of NASA. He was everyone's boss. And I don't think he understands that you can't have a casual discussion with your employee like that. Like, imagine you work for NASA, like you're just this guy, and the head of NASA, who's never been to Houston before, he's always in DC, just waltzes into your office and, hey, we're thinking James Webb. You're probably just going to be like, oh, James Webb. Well, that is an idea. I mean, that could be on the table, and okay. And Sean O'Keefe leaves that conversation being like, everyone loves this idea. And that worker is like, oh man, I hope someone with a higher pay grade than me tells Sean O'Keefe what a stupid idea it is to name a telescope after an administrator. But then the wheels are in motion and no one gets paid enough to be like, this has to stop. This is a bad idea. And 7 weeks later, you're in a meeting with a bunch of top NASA people. Sean O'Keefe's not there. He's in DC, and you're all just like, I guess it's James Webb. I guess this is happening. And you start designing like the logo and you spend $7 million and no one has stopped this stupid thing from happening. And now it's the James Webb Space Telescope and everyone's like, why? Well, one man knows why. One man chose James Webb, and that man was Sean O'Keefe. So why does Sean O'Keefe think that the flagship mission of NASA should be named after an administrator, breaking decades of tradition, ruining, in my opinion, the science communication impact of naming a telescope after a scientist and telling people about scientists? Why? Over the past 2 decades, Sean O'Keefe has been answering that question, why James Webb, in interviews, and he always says like a slight variation on the exact same thing, which is this. Without James Webb, NASA would not exist. Without James Webb, NASA would not exist. Which I think it's very human to look at something like the Apollo missions and say, this was amazing. Who's responsible? Like, I know 40, 80, 100,000 people worked on the Apollo missions, but who can we pin as like the hero? But if you're gonna do that, would you really pick the administrator? I mean, like the scientists who did all the experiments to ensure humans could withstand space flight, the engineers that built the rockets, the calculators that plotted the orbits. There are astronauts who actually went to the moon, and a few astronauts quite literally lost everything during the Apollo missions. But you pick Administrator James Webb as like the winner, the person who without James Webb we couldn't have done the Apollo missions. Like, I don't believe it for a second. I don't like it. Like, you don't get to take credit for the scientists' work because you discussed things with Congress and ensured they had funding. Like, you did the administrative work, great. Name an atrium or a hallway or an administrative building after the fantastic administrator. But he didn't do the science. He was not interested in the science. I want to give this a fair shake, though. What I think Sean O'Keefe is saying is that James Webb articulated very well to Congress and the president that it was important for NASA to be not only a lunar flight organization, but a science organization. Listen to a recording of a meeting with James Webb, President John F. Kennedy, and some other top NASA officials.
Program, I think this program is the top priority program of the agency. No, sir, I do not. I think it is one of the top priority programs, but I think it's very important to recognize here that as you have found what you could do with the rocket, as you found how you could get out beyond the Earth's atmosphere and into space and make measurements, several scientific disciplines that are very powerful have begun to converge on this area. Yeah, I think it is the top priority. I think we ought to have that very clear. Some of these other programs can slip 6 months. The environment of space is where you're going to operate the Apollo and where you're going to do the landing. I know all these other things and the satellite, the communications and weather and all. They're desirable, but they can wait. Oh no, I'm not putting those. I'm talking now about the scientific program to understand the space environment within which you've got to fly Apollo and make a landing on the moon. That's part of science. Going to the moon is the top priority project. Now there are a lot of related scientific information and developments that will come from that, which are important. But the whole thrust of the agency, in my opinion, is the lunar program. The rest of it can wait 6 and 9 months.
What's happening in that meeting is John F. Kennedy is like, the priority is the moon. We're going to the moon. And James Webb has to be like, yes, but we have to do science first. The science is important. The science is necessary to get to the moon. We can't just go to the moon. We don't know how to do that. And JFK is like, I don't understand. I said go to the moon. I want to go to the moon. And
the other part as to whether the actual landing on the moon is what you call the highest priority. They think the highest priority is to understand the environment and the areas of the laws of nature that operate out there as they apply backwards into space. You could say it this way, I think. And Jerry ought to talk on this rather than me. But the scientists in the nuclear field have penetrated right into the most minute areas, the nucleus and the subparticles of the nucleus. Now here out in the universe, you've got the same general kind of a structure, but you can do it on a massive universal scale. I agree that we're interested in, but we can wait 6 months in order. But you have to use that information that they're saying, yeah, but only when that information directly applies to the program. Jim, I think we got to have that.
And James Webb has to articulate that, like, we have to do experiments on Earth first to get to the moon. And please, if you have time, listen to that whole meeting where James Webb is just repeating himself over and over again. And there are scientists there who are like, we don't even understand the lunar surface. We don't know if they can breathe. We don't know how they'll breathe on the moon. We can't send them to the moon yet. And JFK is like, okay, but I just want to go to the moon. So James Webb had a very important job. But when I listen to that meeting, I hear the meetings that must have happened for weeks before, where James Webb was in a room with a bunch of scientists who were like, listen, Mr. Webb, look at me, please. I understand that Kennedy needs to go to the moon. I understand that. But we cannot strap a man to a rocket until we do an experiment on Earth and ensure that the human body can withstand 9 Gs of force and not die. Okay? Otherwise, we run the risk of strapping a man to a rocket and sending him to his death. This is why we need the money, the funding to do an experiment on Earth. We cannot send human beings to the moon and tell them to go onto the lunar surface until we first run a bunch of experiments and devise some sort of suit that will allow them to breathe on the lunar surface. Because if they cannot breathe on the lunar surface, they will die. Do you understand, Mr. Webb? And James Webb was surely like, of course I understand. Great, got it. I'll go tell him. And then the scientist, because I've been in this type of meeting before, had to be like, I want you to repeat back to me what I just said to you. Because it's very important, Mr. Webb, that this information accurately reaches the president, okay? He needs to know we can't just go to the moon. It's not just going to the moon. We have to do science. We have to do science to get to the moon. They're integral to each other. No science, no moon, okay? Okay? And then you heard the meeting. You can hear the scientist's words in James Webb's mouth. He's just like, the nuclear boys, they open the nucleus and all the science comes out. And like very similarly, we'll open the space and the science will come out. It's going to be great, okay? All right? So while I understand the role that James Webb played here, the credit still goes to the scientists and the engineers and the NASA employees who designed all these experiments, who designed and devised a plan to get to the moon and said all of this needs to happen first. I don't think for a second James Webb, NASA administrator, not interested in science, was the person, the sole reason that NASA does science. Right? I know a lot of scientists. You can't tell me for a second that every single time any scientist spoke to James Webb, they weren't also like, and we could get rocks and bring them back. Here's what we could learn from the rocks. And while they're on Earth, we could put mirrors and lasers and we can measure the distance to the moon. And here's 1,100 experiments we could do with the 11 pounds of payload we haven't accounted for yet. That is 100% scientists. Sure, the scientists probably convinced James Webb of its importance, and he, wanting to build a robust and strong space program that would be long-lasting and not just the lunar missions program, was able to recognize the importance of that science mission. But it's still the credit. The credit is the scientists, not the administrator. Like, while the role of NASA administrator is important, and again, by all accounts, James Webb was great at his job, I do not think he deserves to be the namesake of the flagship mission of NASA, the telescope that will change how we view the universe, the greatest human achievement of all time, after a man who was like good at his job at administration but not very interested in science. Like, without James Webb, NASA would not exist. I don't agree. And even if that were the case, he still doesn't earn the telescope. I am insinuating here that Sean O'Keefe, NASA administrator, named the flagship mission of NASA after James Webb, NASA administrator, because NASA administrator Sean O'Keefe thinks the most important person at NASA is the NASA administrator, in an attempt to set the precedent that future missions will also be named after the most important person at NASA, the NASA administrator, such as James Webb, NASA administrator, and Sean O'Keefe, NASA administrator. Pretend everything I just told you about James Webb is all you know. Administrator during the Apollo missions, really good at communicating the importance of science to Congress and to the president, not interested in science. Do you think that person deserves to be the namesake of the greatest telescope we've ever made, the biggest engineering feat of human civilization, the flagship mission of NASA? Does he deserve this? No, right? No. It's supposed to be a scientist. Again, an atrium, an administrative building, perfect for James Webb. He was not interested in science, and honestly, he would probably be super annoyed that the telescope was 14 years behind schedule and $5 billion over budget, because he prided himself of being on time and under budget, right? So I don't like it, and it just seems like, oh, the wheels were in motion, Sean O'Keefe made the name, and like, there's nothing we can do about it, and it just happened, and now we're stuck with this. But there's a controversy. In 2015, 12 years after NASA renamed the Next Generation Space Telescope the James Webb Space Telescope, Dan Savage published a blog post where someone had written in and said, "Hey Dan Savage, how do you feel about the flagship mission of NASA being named after known bigot James Webb?" And I was like, known bigot James Webb? So I read the article, and the article talks about how James Webb was working in the Department of State under the Truman administration at a time known as the Lavender Scare, where homosexual men who worked in the government were outed, they were fired, their livelihoods destroyed. It happened to over 5,000 men between the 1950s and the 1960s. The blog post, though, something I noticed when I was rereading it years later, is that it has a quote from James Webb that is very homophobic, that was on James Webb's Wikipedia page and is no longer on his Wikipedia page. So there has been debate over how instrumental James Webb was in enacting these policies that resulted in the mistreatment of homosexuals in the United States government. So that is the controversy. Should we name a telescope after someone who played a role in these policies? A lot of articles, I think, overstate James Webb's involvement. There's a really good Medium article that does a lot more research and finds that while James Webb definitely worked in the Department of State while these policies were being enacted, he was doing other stuff. But he definitely attended at least one meeting where he had to be given this document being like, here's the problem with homosexuals, and here's how they ruined the government. And so he knew it was happening. And then he left. He worked for NASA. At least one employee at NASA was fired under these policies, not directly fired by James Webb, but if you are the head administrator, you know who's getting fired, especially for security reasons, like being a homosexual in the 60s. Goodness. I think this article does a great job of making it clear that we do not know James Webb's role in these policies. He was not the author of any of these homophobic statements, but he was aware of them. I have read so many interviews with James Webb, and he does not discuss the Lavender Scare. Of course, James Webb died in the 1990s, and people probably didn't have a problem with the Lavender Scare in the 1990s, so maybe he didn't think about it as a problem at all. I severely disagree with the conclusion of this article, which says naming a flagship space observatory after Webb is a fitting recognition of his contributions to NASA science, even if he was just an administrator. Because he didn't contribute to NASA science. He listened to scientists, he got funding, he was a great administrator. That's it. And now he has this asterisk of like, unknown role in persecution of gay government employees. And I think that's enough to be like, we have to change the name. In my opinion, James Webb's unknown role, but definite participation in a department which set out to persecute homosexuals who worked in the government is enough to be like, you don't get a telescope. And if you agree with me, you're probably thinking, Angela, why did you make me watch 30 minutes of your shitty John F. Kennedy impression just to get to this point and say, oh, and also probably a bigot? That's because I don't think a lot of people actually agree with me. A lot of people, the fact that he worked for the Department of State during the Lavender Scare, he was aware of the policies they were enacting, and he did not quit, he did not speak out, he did not release a statement in the next 40 years saying that was a bad call is enough to say you don't get the telescope named after you. You know, you're not canceled. We can still learn about you and your administrative work. I understand you are a complicated person, but surely naming flagship missions after someone is an honor that belongs to only the greatest of the great. And I understand where this opinion takes me. Like, oh, you're not going to name anything after James Webb? I guess you won't name anything after Harry Truman either. Yeah, probably we shouldn't, right? We can put him in a museum. We can learn about his work, but like, this is a bad take. It's a bad guy, all right? Naming things after someone is a statement. It is an endorsement. And what is NASA endorsing when they named their flagship mission after James Webb? Why break 30 years of tradition to name a telescope for the first time after an administrator and not a scientist, and then be left with this? Like, is this gonna inspire the second graders? Are the second graders gonna feel that they wanna work at NASA? Do they think they'll be able to work at NASA when they learn about this? Just, if you can't name it after a scientist, then maybe just don't name it after anyone. Go back to the next generation space telescope, because like nothing associated with TNG could be bad, right? Womp womp. So where this leaves me is still the why. Why? There's absolutely no reason. And now it's turned into this thing where a bunch of reactionary, I'm assuming Russian bots, are claiming that James Webb is this great, amazing scientist integral to the development of rocketry, even though he just was a great administrator. And it's lost the plot. It's a terrible decision. It's not going to inspire anyone. It's such a waste. This is garbage. The science is going to be great no matter what, though. So, like, what a fun, inspirational story. Thanks for watching. This is totally unrelated, but reading the comments on a lot of these articles, there's a bunch of people who say things like, I can't believe we spent $10 billion in space when we won't even take care of our own. And like, first of all, I don't believe you. It's got big energy of Republicans blaming Biden for a formula shortage and then voting against feeding babies. But also, it makes it seem like these people think that the $10 million that was spent on JWST is in space. Like, a rocket engineer is just stapling $100 bills to the chassis, and a graduate student is just delicately picking up a solid gold bar and dusting it and placing it in the payload. That would be really expensive, by the way, but the money was spent on Earth. Like, taxes are collected, the US government gives that money to NASA, and it is disseminated to local businesses who build robot arms and mirrors and steel plates, and it's given to scientists who develop the instrumentation, and it's all spent on Earth. There's no money on the rocket.